Hey, what's up guys? My name is Diana. We're going to be doing 30 days of the Canon M50. So the time has finally come where the Canon M50 is being put to bed. Unfortunately, Canon decided that the M line, that's going to be your Canon M50, the Canon M5, the Canon M6, and the Canon M6 Mark II, and all of the other cameras that start with M from Canon, are officially discontinued. It is the end of an era, and for a lot of creators, this is great news. For some of us, it's kind of sad and bittersweet, but to fully appreciate the value that the Canon M50 truly brought to the marketplace, despite what a lot of people have said, and even I, which you'll see in this video, have said initially when this camera first came out, we have to travel back circa 2017 because the Canon M50 was one of the most important cameras that actually came to market. Let's go back in time. So coming out of 2016, we had all kind of cameras on the market, but around the 2017 timeframe, we had cameras like the Fuji X-T2. It had a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor, had 4K 30 f-log, it was weather sealed, and it had two UHS 2 SD card slots, which this was not the norm, but it also had weak, unreliable autofocus despite its best features, and it was more of that traditional camera body style that you would see with all the dials on the top, and just creators like myself as well as other people just couldn't rock with that long term. But it still was an amazing camera, and as old as that camera is, it was still getting updates many years later, but that still wasn't good enough. We had cameras like the Sony A7III that dropped. That was great. It had 4K 30 and it was pulling from a 6K video quality. And we've seen this all the way up to the Sony ZV-E10 even, that still was using that sensor, but it also had horrible rolling shutter and unfortunately no flip screen. But it did introduce and started to bring to market more reliable autofocus, which you'll see that's a theme around this particular era. And not to mention, stabilization was also extremely weak, especially on the A7III because it didn't have any. And most cameras didn't have stabilization. So getting great, reliable stabilization in the camera that didn't look weird was also a bit much. But because we were also desperate, we had people looking at the Sony A7R Mark II that was around that era. Still had 4K 30, and sometimes the R cameras would come out. Well, most of the time it had better video specs than what the A7S line had, which at this time Sony kind of had a weird skin tone thing, which for a while there was kind of leaning a little greenish and then look a little jaundiced-y. And so that was a big thing of trying to deal with that. And then of course, none of these cameras had, say it with me, a flip screen. And then in this same time frame, you had the Sony A7S as well as the Sony A7S Mark II later on released, and they were dubbed the low light king. And despite as amazing as these cameras were, they still used the awful FW50 batteries. They still had a 30-minute recording limit, which literally all cameras at this time, for the most part, had at this time frame. So you're stuck with that 29 minutes and 59-second moniker. And if you hit that limit, you didn't have some kind of hack, which we'll talk about in a second. If you didn't use something, you were stuck constantly resetting the camera or having to stop and re-record, or just breaking it up into about 20-25 minutes and making sure that you did not go over. So this was a time that we were looking for hacks. We were looking for anything to really just solve these issues. And before we get too deep into all of this, I know there's going to be somebody before the video is even finished saying, well, gear doesn't matter, blah. This ain't that video, because it does in this one. And talk about that, and we will get to that statement in a little bit. But please stick to the plot. So it didn't matter whose camera you were looking at. If you looked at Think Media, and Sean, he was recommending all Canon cameras. If you looked at iJustine, she was using Canon cameras. So everywhere you looked, everybody was using either the Canon 70D or the Canon 80D, especially when you had vloggers, which this is the vlog and content creation era, where you had Casey Neistat dropping videos every single day, because this is the best in the vlog era.
My totally favorite vlogging camera, and this is this here Canon 80D. Before the 80D was the 70D, both great cameras.
And even though these cameras came out earlier, it didn't matter because nobody could hold a candle to Canon when it came to the dual pixel autofocus, a flip out screen that was also touch enabled, a super easy to use menu screen that didn't make you feel kind of ridiculous trying to learn and figure out what to do or how to use it. It had a normal size microphone port, and it recorded high quality 1080p up to 1080p 60 frames per second. And despite what a lot of people may think, or like hearing that now is just like, my phone does way better. It's like, yeah, well, it didn't back then, let alone reliable autofocus to where you didn't have to re-record. Because that's the thing to remember. How annoying is it that if it misses focus, imagine right now if the video just shot to the back instead of it being on me. That's annoying that I would have to re-record that. That happens so many times. Or there's so many older videos that I have where the audio is complete and total garbage because DSLR preamps were terrible. But you could work around it. But if anything else, you could work with the Canon cameras. So you had everybody that was a big name creator on YouTube using Canon cameras, and it just made sense. And this is about the time that I picked up my Canon T5i because I definitely couldn't afford the 70D or the 80D. It was more than I thought a camera should cost. And so I picked up the Canon T5i. I got one of those everything kits that I discourage everybody from buying today. But I got one of those. I didn't know any better. And that got me started in making my first videos, not knowing anything about anything really, but I knew I wanted to start learning, and this got me on that path, and there was no better brand to go with than Canon. That's until Panasonic decided they had enough and they were going to change and shake up the industry when the Panasonic GH5 dropped in March of 2017, but it was announced in January of 2017. It kind of puts you in that mindset of when Muhammad Ali, like on the movie, you had Will Smith hitting the bongos and he's like,
the champ is here! Ladies and gentlemen, the heavyweight champion of the world has arrived!
It was like that in the camera space. It was unheard of. You had 4K, 60p, 10-bit, internal, unlimited recording in the camera, no special things needed, an incredible battery life, amazing, absolutely amazing stabilization, 2 SD card slots. And when Panasonic dropped this camera, it was so funny because when they did the announcement video, I remember this specifically on a couple ones, like, I think it was like B&H Photos YouTube channel. The guy Sean that always does the releases, he was kind of jabbing at Sony because, and a lot of everybody, because they were having overheating issues out the wazoo. And so he wrapped it up by saying, oh, and by the way, you get all of that with no overheating. Sounds a little familiar as some of the stuff we're dealing with today though too. And then this is when you started to see Sony being taken way more seriously, and they needed to get away from the overheating title that they had at the time. With the A6000, the A6300 camera, you also had the A6500 that came out that introduced eye autofocus in photo mode, and it still was suffering with that FW50 battery. And in 2018, they released the Sony A7III. This was a full frame 24 megapixel sensor that had eye autofocus not only in photos but in videos, face tracking that was completely reliable and fast, where nobody was touching Canon except for Canon. Nobody could hold up to what they were doing when it came to dual pixel autofocus, but you could only find it on the Canon 70D and the Canon 80D, which at the time, these were over $1,000 cameras. That's a lot of money. But Sony being Sony, they was throwing everything that they had at this. And this was a 1080p, 120 frames per second, which most companies were not doing 120 frames per second in 1080p, and Sony did. You also had better IBIS performance than they had in most of the other cameras, especially when it came to like APS-C bodies. The only people that were doing IBIS extremely well is Olympus, and then you had Panasonic. Otherwise, you didn't have anything for the most part. You had digital stab. That's when gimbals became more of a thing. And even before that, you just had manual stabilizers that people were just kind of using whatever they had to make stuff work, even weighing down the cameras to make them heavier to get better stabilization. Needless to say, it was rough out in these real and digital streets. But that still didn't stop there with the features. It was 4K 24 frames per second, pulling down from the 6K sensor readout, and it was fast with 95% coverage of that, which is most of the time you were looking at 60, 70, maybe 80 for some cameras, depending on how old your stuff was, which this is now coming out of the era where you were holding on to your camera for as long as people used to. Once DSLRs really started rolling, then we started to introduce more reliable mirrorless cameras, because that's the biggest crux. People were not seeing mirrorless as completely reliable. Battery life was crazy. Nobody really got it for real. They didn't think it was going to be a thing. It just seemed like a fad. But that's until this camera came out. And on top of all of this, this new full frame camera that came to market was $2,000. Unheard of in the camera industry. People went nuts. It's pandemonium in the camera space at this point, because you're getting all of this stuff for $2,000. So now you have the Canon 80D A6500 thrown in there as well, the Panasonic GH5, in addition to the Sony A7III. And these are some of the biggest contenders on the market at the time. This is when you started to see the gear doesn't matter era start to come up in a lot of content, because everybody was racking their brains, and me included, because I was trying a bunch of different Panasonic cameras. I had got the Canon T5i, then found out the Canon M3 existed, and I fell in love with that camera and really became really introduced to that. But then I was like, I want 4K and unlimited recording. And so I was looking at the G85, and so I got that, and then I went to the X8 and then the G7 for the Panasonic. I had a lot of cameras, but we were desperate trying to just get basic needs of 4K video, reliable autofocus, a regular microphone port that had a quieter preamp, which mirrorless cameras introduced, and all DSLR cameras had a horrible internal preamp. That's why we would just load music on top of it and have the volume up so that we could kind of cover over that. Otherwise, you had to record separately to an external recorder and sync that up in post. And the editing programs and the YouTube tutorials and stuff of today is not the way that stuff was back then. It was rough finding good quality content that was accurate and up to date. So when you hear people say gear doesn't matter, a lot of times these days it's used out of context, and people are comparing gear and buying excessive amounts of gear, usually when they get into that gear acquisition syndrome or gas, versus just making content and focusing on the value that you're bringing to the table. But you have to think about all this stuff that I just shared, all of that era that everybody came out of trying to just find what was going to really work. So people were buying and trying, and not as many people were creating as they were doing all this stuff, getting stuck into an analysis paralysis. And this is where the value of gear doesn't matter became a thing. But then you fast forward to hearing that today, and like I said, 99% of the time people are using that out of context, because content today was never ever on trial of whether or not it was more important than the gear, because quiet as kept, gear actually does matter. Because you think about all the problems that I listed, gear was extremely important, because they had so many problems with just basic stuff that getting the right gear meant you could confidently create with the freedom of just thinking about the content, because the gear wasn't getting in the way. Whereas before, you had all kind of loops and hoops to jump through, and this camera can do this, but this one can't. It can do this feature, it has this one, but it can't. Like, it was just too much. So for a time, we did have to just, you know what, it's not going to be a perfect camera. There's not even going to be one that's close to one. And I just need to figure out what makes the most sense to me otherwise, or decide if I'm sick and tired of dealing with autofocus, and then I'm just going to go to Canon, but I know I'm not going to get the best video specs ever, and not all cameras are created equal over there. Sony is doing great stuff, but the rolling shutter is awful, and we don't have a flip screen, and it just freaking drives you nuts. But now we don't have that issue. Gear actually does matter, because getting the right stuff allows you to create freely and not have to think about it, versus getting the wrong gear creates problems that you now have to fix, and too many learning curves equal a circle, which means you're not creating content and you're not focusing on doing the thing of why you bought all this gear and stuff to begin with. And this is why the Canon M50, when it came out, despite my initial grumblings and frustrations with that camera, was one of the most instrumental cameras to come to market, even though literally it seemed like all of us hated it collectively. But we also had to remember what's all the crap that we've been dealing with for years in the camera industry. Unless you could afford a cinema camera, unless your content earned you enough money, or your business earned you enough money to invest in multiple brands of cameras. So people were mixing and matching all kinds of stuff. You just got tired of it. The Canon M50 had the dual pixel, reliable autofocus. It had decent enough battery life that you could work with it. It also had a dummy battery that would go with the camera as well. You also had 4K in the camera, albeit not with reliable autofocus, and a major crop on it on top of the camera already being APS-C, but we just didn't care. And you had a regular microphone port of all things on the camera as well, a flip out screen that you could touch and change settings, and it actually looked really good. No weird color shifts and stuff with your skin. And so you could just shoot stuff straight out the camera, and now we could just focus on creating content. And for me, this was everything, because it allowed me to just start thinking outside the box. When I had my friend that was like putting on events locally and I would be invited to speak to some of them, it's like I started to be able to record my talks because I know I could record them confidently from afar because the autofocus would keep up. Whereas with Panasonic, I would have it focus on the back of the room and it's like nothing but a blank wall. I started traveling and vlogging and experimenting with creating outside of my home office and really just understanding the value of documenting your own story. And we saw this in the vlog era with Casey Neistat and especially Gary Vee really doing a lot to really put this bug in entrepreneurs' mind so that they understood that documenting and capturing your experience is the value that you need to have in your business moving forward because of the level that content creation was going to be. And yes, you had cameras like the Logitech C920, which was great, 1080p quality, but it's stuck attached to a computer where I can just have basic, reliable stuff in a basic camera that didn't cost that much money. The preamps also weren't terrible because it was a mirrorless camera instead of it being a DSLR camera. So even though I came kicking and screaming to this camera, it launched one of the most successful series to date, and probably how some of you that are watching this video right now found me at all, or was at least introduced to me, or because of that series, it led to me getting interviews. And it was so nice that I was putting all of the stuff that I was learning, just like everybody else on YouTube, about the importance of documenting over creating and not worrying about the vlogs not getting like the views that you might think would a vlog would, because it was more important to me to document and capture and create my story and my journey. And that was the camera that I had the day that I quit my job, because I was carrying my camera with me every day, just practicing and trying to get better. So already been in the thick of like having done the series, following up, doing live streams regularly. We launched the Friday live on the YouTube channel, started doing a lot of educational live streams and started kicking off even more of my live stream experience. And then of course, 2020 happened and then the pandemic hit. Now, all of this camera stuff starts to come back up. And all of those cameras that I mentioned, now it's like the value's different because we need clean HDMI and the M50 didn't have that. And thankfully, thank the Lord, Ecamm came to the rescue. I'm still grateful to this day. So it's 2020, we're all stuck in the house, and these are the cameras that we have available to us. And everything has a limitation, but one of the best all-around cameras was the Canon M50. And again, that's probably how a lot of y'all came to the channel. And I'm super grateful for the opportunities that created for me, because it led me into finding the cameras that ended up being right for me. Because quite as kept, it's like summer of 2019 is when I actually switched to Sony. I just continued to teach on the M50 until it just became, in my opinion, not the best option for content creators. Not that it's a bad camera, but if you're a content creating entrepreneur, you're doing public speaking, you're doing live streaming and all this stuff, past a point, limitations became too much of a real big issue, and it just became a bigger and bigger problem. Running into that 2959 for the recording limit became real old. Being stuck on never having clean HDMI, so you can't get the better quality. It wasn't bad, but thankfully with Ecamm, we could get the USB because they natively did it. And I don't know if y'all remember, but you had to use, it was another program that was not reliable if you didn't have a Mac. And so it was like, you know what? I'm getting a Mac and I'm just gonna go this route. And I did in 2018. It was one of the best decisions ever, because Ecamm decided to go out on a limb and they started to do the work that the camera brands were not doing even before the pandemic in 2018. And they started making it possible to just use a basic USB data capable cable with not just the Canon M50, but other Canon cameras, because I wound up testing and doing beta testing for a lot of this stuff. You had the Nikon cameras and all this stuff, and we just kept testing. until it was like a group of us that finally got just a big list of cameras that could work via USB, since clean HDMI wasn't an option on a ton of these cameras. So I'm super grateful to Ecamm because they definitely saved the day, and they have continued to remain that just incredible brand at heart. I'm even still using it right now to do this video with my Sony ZV-E1, but it just made everything like that much easier and not have to wait for some of these camera brands to kind of like pitch in and do the work. Plus having a great recording and live streaming software, bring comments on the screen, customize it, do screen share, just a ton of stuff. And so if you want to get 2 months for free, you can use my promo code Diana 2 months, like 2 months, but MOS 2 months. And so you can get 2 months free trial of the Ecamm live software at dana.link/Ecamm. But this ain't a promo video or nothing like that. It's not sponsored. I just love the software, and it's meant a lot to me, and it's helped me not waste time. So something worth checking out. And I know for a lot of you all, when I switched to Sony and more publicly, it's like, okay, I'm done making the M50 videos. I literally made like over 50, not like counting live streams and stuff, not counting interviews, just tutorials, just to make sure that since we were all stuck at home, especially, just making stuff that much easier. And even before then, and again, some of those are some of my best videos that have ever performed on the channel with the most engagement and hashtag all the things, just because it was the right amount of features in a good, reliable camera that I could leave on for days at a time that never failed me, honestly. And that's saying something. And I think the M50 line had a lot of potential, and it could have been more than what it became. But we know once Canon and Nikon decided to take mirrorless more seriously, and they started to release the R and the Z6 and Z7 cameras. Yeah, those weren't the best cameras at the time, and they didn't do anything in quiet as kept. It's like the M50 specs, and the way it performed was better than the R series. But you started to look at what it was going to make possible. And at that point, I already knew, especially like I said, towards the end of 2019, especially by the time 2020 hit, the M line was not going to survive. So we knew this day was coming. We just were hoping maybe they'll do something, because they weren't producing lenses. The saving grace of the M50 line, or the M series line, because they had the M5 that flipped down and that was weird. You also had the M6 that was cool and it flipped up. But again, they would just include this in one camera, not include that one. It's like, who's making these decisions? But again, it's neither here nor there. It's in the past. So I knew at that point, like when I saw what they were doing with the R series and I saw the history of how they would behave, and most of these cameras just have a history of doing similar things, like they continue making those same decisions in their lineup, and that's across the board for everybody. The brand that I felt like was most going to fit my needs the best, and where I really found a home, was with Sony cameras. And so around the summer or fall of 2019 is when I made the switch to Sony, and I got this Sony A6400. Actually, was gifted to me. That and this lens now that I'm shooting on right now is amazing. I just started using Sony, and I'm like, this is it. This is it for me. Like, they're doing the stuff that I wanted. And unfortunately, like, the M50 line could have been incredible. Again, like, especially because you had more companies starting to make more lenses for it, especially once Sigma made their series for that camera. You had the Sigma 16, you got the Sigma 30 and 50. It's just like, yes, finally good primes. You already had the EFS, which was the DSLR APS-C line, and then you had the EF line, that was the full frame line, also DSLRs. So you had an incredible lens lineup, but you knew once they switched over to mirrorless, essentially they were going to leave all those lenses in the past. And unfortunately, they've continued kind of in that same pattern, if you will, about not giving lens support to third parties for whatever reason, when it was brands like Sigma that honestly saved their bacon. So I say and share all of this because it is super emotional. I'm not even gonna trip. It's like super emotional to remember like why this camera was so incredible. And that's why I said, like in the beginning of this video, it was one of the most important cameras to come to market, because it came at the most critical point where cameras just were not great all-arounders. And despite not having everything and doing everything well, the budget entry level forgotten about don't care EFM line camera that they just made one, it seemed like to make one and say, fine, here's 4K in a camera that's mirrorless, but autofocus ain't gonna work. But we ain't gonna talk about that. But here you go. Here's a camera now. Be quiet. And that camera that they just kind of threw out there became the camera that honestly saved their butt and just was one of the best sellers ever. And I can't be too mad at it because that's the camera that helped to build my brand and make things that much easier. And I know some of y'all gonna complain in the chat because yeah, it's like you got us on the M50 and then you left and went to Sony. Ain't nobody tell you to buy the camera because I bought it. That's all I'm saying. Hey, you bought it because it fit your needs. But I'm curious though, real talk. What is your favorite M50 memory, whether it's from something that you created? It could be around this era of cameras and the content creation. Like, when did you get into all of this? I shared all this because I was around. I was on everybody's live. You had the Monday live, that camera guide, and where I met a lot of y'all were doing. It's like that camera guy and Jason Bond were doing. And you see, if you go back in that history, if those live streams are even still available, you'll see us a lot of us. Well, I met Amda Brown. It's like I met a lot of y'all that I see on the channel and we still talk to this day. And it came all because around this M50 camera and the A7 III and the Panasonic GH5 and all the rest. And so I hate to see it go, but there's a good reason for a lot of people to not be mad about it, because this is still going to be a good 1080p, reliable, decent all-around camera with good microphone preamps and reliable autofocus. And now you can get around the clean HDMI issue and not have to worry about the recording limit, you know, and all of that. But I think because it'll be on sale and it'll be cheaper and people will be, you know, selling across the used market, it has the potential to go two ways. Either a lot of people will get it and it becomes just one of those legendary cameras that, even though it's old, a lot of people want it and still want to use it, or it just becomes a really, really great budget-friendly all-around camera that in 2024 and even 2025 and beyond will still be a good, basic, reliable camera. Fare thee well, Canon M50, and to the M line, the M6 and M6 Mark II. And all those other cameras. It's been an incredible journey. And to that, we say peace.